Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 6th of September 2024. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the screen at the moment. Although the yellow lines, I'm not updating the deep state map at the moment. The yellow lines that you see on my map are the fortifications that have been mapped. Predominantly Russian fortifications. Okay, so we are going to go to the Kursk area where the Ukrainians are still trying to push in some areas of that, although it's certainly slowed down. Indeed, we have Suryat maps scaling back some of the Russian gains, and it looks very different there to Andrew Perpetua's mapping. In fact, the whole of this northern area sees a massive difference between the two mappers. In some places it might be as much as sort of 9 kilometers there, so that's a huge difference. And Andrew Perpetua is much more charitable, which I suppose for the Ukrainian way around, it is funny. If this was the Russian incursion into Ukraine, you would have that reversed. Surat Maps is much more generous for Russia and much less so for Ukraine. Here we have Andrew Perpetua saying the Russians have been pushed much further back in the north, and we've had a bit of a scaling back. There was some agreement previously, but here we have the Russians pushing the Ukrainians back to a smaller area of control than they previously had. Andrew Perpetua has a tiny sort of area over here, just on the edge of Koronevo, that he now maps as under Russian control. Ukrainians haven't had too much success moving through Koronevo, although it is, I think, a bit of a hellhole that at the moment is getting quite a battering. If we come and look at this area, particularly around Kamyshovka, as it's and Kamyshevka, so Kamyshevka actually is what we're going to talk about here. So that is here. The mapping, as according to null reports, is that in the Kursk region the Ukrainians have taken Naidanov and is attacking towards Kamyshevka. Geolocated images shared by Russian forces and sources confirmed, that Ukrainian troops, presumably given the Russian striking pattern coming from the south, have moved into the village and are advancing towards Kamyshevka. Earlier fighting east of Kamyshevka was reported, so that is Ukraine is in control of this village and pushing through to Kamyshevka. So there could be some gains. It could be that whole area is under Ukrainian control, and actually that's what Andrew Perpetua has and Surat Maps does not. So a bit of a disagreement there. As we come further to the side, the Ukrainians are taking control of a little bit of Cherkaskoye, Porechnoye there, and moving a little bit towards the east. So some push and shove, a few gains here for the Ukrainians, a few gains there for the Russians in the Kursk area. So as of September the 5th, the occupiers have also built at least 2 pontoon crossings in the Kursk region. Actually, what do we have? No reports does talk about this as well. Here, Russia set up yet another pontoon crossing in the Kursk region north of Glushkovo. So that is to say here, one in the area of Shagarovo north of Glushkovo, another one in the area of Zvanoye. So that's to say over here we have the same river, comes down into Tetkina, so up here and across. So north of Glushkovo here and back again in, where do we have it? Zvanoye as well, which is... goodness me, it's disappeared. It should be around here. Yeah, there it is. It's one area there. So another pontoon bridge there. The Ukrainians keep trying to hit those pontoon bridges, but we haven't seen any movement either to the west or from the west to the east or from the south to the north here into this area. It could be that the Ukrainians are shaping that area, doing shaping operations, ready for an attack into the area south of the same river, or maybe they don't have enough capability. Maybe they've had to draw some troops away from here to help shore up the Pokrovsk region. I guess we shall see. So moving on now to the to one of the Kharkiv sectors where the Russians have got some purchase inside Ukraine, and around the one to the north, directly to the north of Kharkiv, just south of Lyubike, the Ukrainians, according to both mappers, have made some gains. So here, pushing Andrew Perpetua has them pushing the Russians right back to the edge of Lukyantsy there. Not so much for Surat Maps, which shows quite a considerable difference between the two lines, about 1.25 kilometer difference there, and just sort of southeast of Geopolitics, we have the Russians being pushed back here. General agreement in some of this area. So yeah, both mappers saying that the Ukrainians have had some success there, and that could well be because this is one of the areas where the Russians have pulled troops in order to defend the Kursk sector. The claim is that the Russians, and this is from Zelensky, the Russians have lost 6,000 troops killed and wounded in the last month here, which is pretty bad for the Russians, and that they have drawn 60,000 troops from various places and are plugging them into this area to stop the Ukrainian advances. And the Ukrainians are not advancing considerably there, as we have seen. It's been fairly stagnant for the last week, and you might say that that is a real shame. The Ukrainians have ground to a halt, and they have ground to a halt. They've, in some sense, culminated, or at least come up against enough defensive forces there to stop any further advance. And you could say, oh, that's an issue for the Ukrainians, but actually that's one of the objectives being reached for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians wanted the Russians to pull troops there to try and stop them. So if the Ukrainians aren't moving further forward in Kursk, that's not a problem. Do not get down that the Ukrainians are no longer making advances here. If the Russians have 60,000 troops, if they truly have 60,000 troops here, then those 60,000 troops are not somewhere else, which means those 60,000 troops are now on the defensive and they're not on the offensive in various parts of the Eastern Front Line. And when we look at the Eastern Front Line, we now see a day of more blue pins than we have seen for a good month or two. And that's no coincidence. I'm absolutely sure that is no coincidence. Kursk, I maintain, has been, and still is a huge success. The Russians have managed to take more of Pokrovsk, but even now they're losing some of Pokrovsk, taking other parts, but it's certainly stabilized compared to what it was. And the Ukrainians are taking way more of Kursk than the Russians have taken of Pokrovsk, and indeed anywhere else. Indeed, what the stats are something like the Ukrainians have taken twice the amount of land this year in Kursk that the Russians have done all across the rest of the front. I don't know if that's exactly correct, but the point is that territorially this has been a greater gain than the Ukrainians have conceded, right? This year. So I think it's been a huge success, and we now have a bit of a mottled front line in terms of pins because of Kursk. Okay, so I maintain it has been a success, right? Although there are no changes in the front line around, so just to let you know where we are, we're in the northeastern axis from Kupiansk down to Svatove to Kreminna here, and we're going to go up to Sinkivka. I don't have it mapped here, but the latest from Surat maps, actually this is the one north of Lipsy, where the Ukrainians have recaptured a series of positions. We do have this, I haven't mapped it yet because that's just come in, so the situation on the northeastern front during the last 7 days, the Russians have secured the southern part of Sinkivka according to Surat maps. Bit of a difference here because this isn't just a small case of a difference between the two mappers of, say, 1 kilometer or so. This is the difference of the Russians controlling large parts of Sinkivka, which is fairly significant, and Surat maps seems to suggest that they've now captured this part of Sinkivka, and that puts them ever closer to Kupiansk. So I think that would be significant if that is the case. Andrew Perpetua, as of yet, hasn't made a change, although that could come tomorrow, but quite a difference there, and it's a difference of a settlement, not just a few fields here and there. Okay, no change to the rest of the front line along the whole northeastern axis all the way down to Chaziv Yar. So that's really significant. No change to Seversk, Serebiansky Forest, Terny and Torska, and then the whole northeastern front line, apart from, according to Andrew Perpetua, and this is more aligning his mapping with what Surat maps had previously had anyway, so it might not have happened in the last week, last day or so. This is around Brestova, Novoselivska, and pushing on further to the west, the Russians sort of moving on, maybe looking to equalize this the southern part of that salient that they have towards towards the Oskil River, and that is a worrying one around Pischani. They seem to have had real success there, and I would be worried about this from the Ukrainian point of view because they are dangerously close to the Oskil River. On the other hand, essentially, this is all entirely... I mean, you don't want to see this territory from a kind of PR point of view, because if you look here, you've got the white dashed lines, and this is the remaining part of Luhansk Oblast that the Russians at the moment do not control, right? There are a few areas of Luhansk Oblast that they would like to get their hands on so that they can say they have taken Luhansk, okay? But other than that, this is just kind of land to the east of the Oskil River. The Oskil River is a great defensive line. You could make an argument that, as terrible as it is that the Russians have made these territorial gains, it's not all that significant, and the Ukrainians can make the Russians bleed for every kilometre they try and gain up till the Oskil River. It's all about the Oskil River there, but it's the PR aspect of Luhansk Oblast, possibly. Anyway, it's just me waffling on, probably making little sense. Right, coming on down to Chasiv Yar, we have some interesting changes here. We'll first look at Chasiv Yar, where the Russians have apparently, according to Syriac maps, taken some area to the west of the canal at Kalinivka. If we go to Syriac maps, they say that over the last 2 days, the Russians have taken control over new positions on the western part of Kalinivka. However, and as you can see here, Syriac maps differs very much from Andrew Perpetua, with having this amount of land, and particularly here for some time now, they've got a good few roads and blocks in Chasiv Yar itself under their control, according to Syriac maps, but not according to Andrew. So Andrew then has said today, I am not convinced Russians actually control the area west of the canal in Chasiv Yar. We've been geolocating Russians there for a while. If you scroll back through our map, you can see the geolocations and you can see the videos. You can see what the area looks like. The area is not conducive to being controlled by anyone. Ukraine has thick drone coverage, and anyone who passes through the area has a very high chance of dying. Furthermore, the structures are completely destroyed, and there aren't many suitable places for defence. I doubt anyone controls this area. I doubt anyone could control the area, no matter how much they wanted to, or how many resources they put into it. Furthermore, the sources I have in the area insist that there has been no change in the area of control of Chasiv Yar. So if you want to say Russia controls it, I mapped it that way at one point but changed it for the above reasons, then you should have said so the whole time. In other words, nothing's changed. So either you said this for the whole time or don't say it. So I guess you could argue that Syriac maps had said that for a long time, but it actually wasn't the whole time. It's somewhat recently they moved that, but there wasn't really any change in what was going on there. But anyway, if you think guys laying in shallow foxholes while drones drop Molotov cocktails on them, did I tell you the Ukrainian drone units here drop Molotov cocktails, is control, then knock yourself out. But I've seen a very large number of Russians burned to death, i.e. controlling it. I would generally agree with Andrew Perpetua here. He has a real handle on the video evidence coming out of all of these places, and him and his team will be geolocating drone strikes and realizing that the Russians go there, they get Molotov cocktails dropped on their heads, they burn, they die. Do they control that? Not in any meaningful sense. They are there and they're getting hit. It's I think probably a good example of what a grey zone is in this war. Now, you might have a grey zone where you see more Russians than you do Ukrainians, but do they control it in the sense that they can supply it? If you can easily get supplies there, then I would say that, you can control it. For example, Kalinivka here, both of them agree that Kalinivka is under Russian control, and that's undoubtedly because they can get vehicles into Kalinivka, supply their troops, get food, drink, water, blah, blah, blah. Whereas on this side of the canal, they're probably sending troops in, but can you get water to them? Can you get supplies to them? Or do they have to nip back across? Or do they have to wait for some more troops to pop along that maybe have a few more supplies in their backpacks or whatever? I doubt you could easily supply this area. So it's not I don't think very robustly under Russian control. Now, this area, there's been some massive changes today, and I'm not sure what to make of this. It'll be interesting to see what Andrew has to say about here, because there was already a big difference between the two mappers in Klishchiivka. So Klishchiivka is this area south of Bakhmut, where you've got the railway line that comes down here, follows along down there. You've got, actually I do have, sorry, I've got deep state maps showing here, and I really shouldn't have, because I said I wasn't showing them, and there I am showing you deep state maps, so that's a bit irresponsible. Okay, so here we have, we had a big difference between the two mappers, and now it's got bigger. Andrew Perpetua has the Russian line back there, and Surat Maps had it there. So there's already a 2 kilometer difference, 2.2 kilometer difference. And it's not just a case of some fields. This is Klishchiivka. Now, Klishchiivka is a place that's been reduced entirely to rubble, rather like you were saying about those streets of Klishchiivka, of Chasiv Yar. There's no place that you can hide here. So therefore, you know, this is grey zone. Ukrainian troops will come up here, do some stuff, you get hammered. Russian troops come down here, do some stuff, get hammered. So you don't really want to hang out in Klishchiivka too much, especially since this is high ground all back here. And you have this area of trench network here. Now, Surat Maps has had that trench network under Russian control, then they took it away, then they added it back in. Andrew Perpetua saying no, it wasn't under Russian control, definitely, and here's the evidence to suggest it wasn't. But that was some months back. I don't know what the situation is now. And for Surat Maps to now say today that the Ukrainians have been pushed all the way back to the canal here, and the Russians have taken control over the entirety of the high ground there, is really significant. It's not like the end of the world. Actually, to be fair, the Ukrainians really could pull back to the canal and it's not a problem. I'm surprised they've held on for this long. I'm really amazed that the Ukrainians have held out in Klishchiivka, probably because of that trench network at the top of the hill just to the west of Klishchiivka. But I'm really surprised they've held on to this area for as long as they have. This white line or grey line represents the May the 30th Russian front line before the Ukrainian counterattacks last year, in summer last year. The Ukrainians pushed the Russians back since then and got them all the way back to here. And then the Russians have chipped away, and then it's been stalled here for ages, months really. It's been stalled in the Klishchiivka area. If the Russians have taken that, then that is interesting. Definitely pretty significant, I would argue. Indeed, we'll look at the Surat Maps claims for this area. See if we have that. It was, I think it is here. Yeah, okay. So the situation south of Bakhmut during the first hours of September, Russia managed to reach a canal from Klishchiivka after the Ukrainian army retreated following the loss of the hills to the west of the locality. During the following days, the Russian forces managed to take control of the surrounding trench systems, which were recaptured by the Ukrainian forces during the summer counteroffensive of 2023. Now, that's interesting in itself. So that may have happened, right? But the idea that the Russians just took control of the trench systems when they have been claiming for months that he had been claiming for months that the Russians controlled the trench systems is kind of bizarre. So you can see where he previously had the Russian control zone already in control of the trench systems, and now he's saying, the Russians have taken the area to the canal, and as a result of taking control of the trench systems that the Ukrainians had taken in the counteroffensive. So I don't know, it's a little bit confusing. Anyway, it will be interesting to see whether the Russians have actually done that. Then we're going to come further to the south. Now, this is going into the Toretsk sort of area where the Russians have had some success in the Druzhba neck of the woods. Taking more control over that settlement, controlling most of it. That's north of the railway line that skirts past the north of Toretsk. Toretsk has been stabilized. That's really important. The Ukrainians have brought in some decent troops to the area. Apparently the Azov regiment have been active in Toretsk and New York. And you can see some much anticipated blue pins in the New York area. And that's really good news. So all translated here says Russian sources confirm successful Ukrainian counterattacks in Donetsk Oblast, in Seladovo, Toretsk and New York. So we'll come to Seladovo, but Toretsk and New York's where we're at the moment. What is happening is exactly what was predicted, says this Russian source. The Ukrainian armed forces have begun counterattacking the areas of Seladovo, Toretsk and New York. Thus, the enemy still has reserves, and with them, he can influence the pace of our offensive. In addition, the enemy is trying to cling to Ukrainsk, so that's another settlement that actually the Russians have taken control of, using units of the 25th Separate Airborne Brigade. All this is happening against a backdrop of reports of ongoing mobilization and plans to form a kind of voluntary force corps in Europe. By the way, Ukrainian citizens returning from European countries to the liberated territories confirm the intensification of recruitment efforts for the Ukrainian armed forces in Poland and the Czech Republic, which is something we'd heard previously, but that's a Russian source there. And then we come to Surat maps that say that since the beginning of the week, Ukrainian army managed to completely drive out Russian forces from the locality of Nepilivka, and then to take new positions in the north of the town of New York. Thanks to this, it was possible to consolidate a supply line for the troops entrenched in the phenolic factory, where they have been holding out for almost 3 weeks. Moreover, a Ukrainian attempt to enter west of the town was repelled by Russian forces. Okay, so a few things here. First of all, the Azov regiment supposedly came and secured, allowed, I presume this is a factory that they're talking about. There were some Ukrainians that were supposedly surrounded there, and the Azov brigade came and freed them up and also took back some ground, and considerable amounts of ground, considering, you know, this is all of New York that was taken supposedly. So Surat maps had the Russian line all the way back here, and that's now been pushed back to here. Andrew Perpetua had the Russian line further to the south, but still pushed back in pretty much the same area. So broad agreement, although there's some interesting difference here in that northwestern part of New York. And actually massive difference over here, like huge difference, kilometers worth of difference between, 1.7 kilometers between the two there. But generally in the center of New York, they agree that this area, phenolic factory, I presume, is now under control of the Ukrainians. We have not that. No, it was this morning actually, so I don't have it anymore. But there was lots of claims about what was going on in New York and the Azov Brigade, but I had that in my early morning update. Nonetheless, good news that the Ukrainians are putting up some serious resistance to the Russian gains, and not only stopping them but reversing them there, and also reversing them in Seladovo. This is an area. So first of all, it's worth noting that there's been stability on this part of the front line for some time. No change here for ages, and very little change actually from Ocheretina sort of upwards in that northwesterly direction towards the T0504 highway connecting Pokrovsk up to Konstantinivka. I was expecting that to be interdicted directly. I think it's under fire control, but I was expecting that to be directly interdicted, and it hasn't been. And there's been stability all around here. The Russians have had much more joy pushing southwest in a southwesterly direction down here towards Andriivka, all the way down there, and Karakovo. So it could be that they fancy making their way towards Karakovo, although they haven't had any success pushing towards Karakovo through Marinka and Terivka and further on from there. So interesting that's holding on. But the Ukrainians appear to have come to the rescue in Seladovo and pushed the Russians right back, almost out of the settlement towards the east there. So really significant gains for the Ukrainians, taking all of these blocks. I mean, that's some significant land. What it could be is that actually the Russians might not have been solidly in control. It could be a typical Surat maps claim. And as you see, like, Andrew Perpetua has not changed a single thing in that area, and there is still a difference of about 2.25 kilometers between Andrew Perpetua and Surat maps there. So even though Surat maps has taken the Russian control line quite far back, there still remains a huge difference between the mappers. So the Seladova area, what the Surat map says is that during the last 48 hours, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack and managed to recapture most of the town of Seladova and parts of Mikhailivka as well. So really good news if that is indeed happening. It's worth noting that Pokrovsk is getting hammered. I mean, this is visuals of Pokrovsk. The sort of idea of liberation there is flatten the city, move in, put up your flag and say, yeah, we've liberated you. Well done. Didn't you want us to come here? I mean, we flattened it for you. These were all the apartment blocks you used to live in. That's what you wanted, right? You wanted us to do this, didn't you? Oh, okay. No, maybe you didn't. So thanks for that liberation. So Pokrovsk is getting absolutely hammered. That's not far away, just a number of kilometers from the front line. From Surat Maps' idea of front line, it's about 9 kilometers, but a little bit further for other mappers. So in the Pokrovsk direction, there's now quite a bit of footage coming out of Ukrainians fighting back, sort of tanks and BMPs and things getting blown up. So this is a tank supported by BMPs destroying Russian positions and buildings with the occupiers. So I mentioned that previously. Just stuff like this coming out, although you're not going to learn anything particularly by looking at this. I think there is one thing you do learn, and that is that the Ukrainians are putting up more resistance now than they were previously, and that seems to be definitely the case. Now, the Karadag are another group that has come into this area and are, I think, largely responsible for resistance around here. In this Mikhailivka area, there is a bridge. I probably should have geolocated the bridge. I don't know exactly where it is. But it's a bridge where the Russians have been trying to hang out underneath it. I don't know if it's up there or much further back here. But anyway, there's a bridge somewhere there in Mikhailivka where they have had I think it's a BTR APC taken out the other day with people hit by a tank, and then that same tank supposedly has then done some damage to more vehicles trying to hide under that same bridge, and they've actually captured a vehicle from the Russians there as well. So lots of activity. You can go and watch various pieces of footage of tank fights or at least tanks firing off at Russian equipment in the village of Mikhailivka. You variously see that online. It won't be too hard to find. So there's fierce fighting around there. Ukrainians are definitely pushing back against Russians. On the other hand, just to the southeast, the Russians are having some success getting towards Ukrainsk, and that was that place that was mentioned earlier. Andrew Perpetua, I think, has got a set of tweets on this area that the Russians are definitely having some success towards there. So it's 6 and 1, half a dozen the other in pretty much the same general area. Both mappers having the Russians making some gains here, and fairly significant gains as well. Even if you look at Andrew Perpetua's, which is less charitable than Surat Maps, that's still almost 2.75 kilometers of advance in the south, to the south of Ukrainsk. So some fairly significant Russian gains there. But actually, all things considered, there's some good news for the Ukrainians, where good news has been a real scarcity. Then when we come down south of the Pokrovsk region, we cut past Mariinka, as mentioned, no change there. And then we come further to the south past Northern Mikhailivka, and good news for the Ukrainians is there is no further change to the mapping in the Vuhledar and Vodyanye area just north of Vuhledar along that road. They're reporting from Ukraine, did a video on this area. I don't know if it's today's one or yesterday's one, so you can go and check that out. Gives you a sense of what's going on around particularly the mine here. So this mine, there's heavy fighting taking place there. This is a potentially very useful place for the Ukrainians because they can store stuff underground and keep it safe. But I don't know if that's going to be long for control. There's another mine area just over here as well that's going to be useful for the Ukrainians too. You've got these terracons, which are always... I mean, they're useful. They give you high ground. The only problem is you're also quite... you're unprotected up there. So if you have, I don't know, let's say a mortar crew stuck up here, that's great. You can get loads of extra visuals on the enemy and extra range, but on the other hand, you're sitting plumb on top of a pile of earth or pile of slag, and the Russians can just take you out with FPV drones and whatnot. So yeah, it gives with one hand, takes with the other. But anyway, fierce fighting over those mines. And as we come to the west of Vuhledar, you have this area of Prichistivka, where the Russians are making some gains further to the south of there. All the mappers agree that, all the mappers, but both the mappers I'm using here agree that the Russians have made some fairly sizable gains. Andrew Perpetua taking their line from here. They've kind of filled in this hole to the south of Prichistivka. So they took that settlement and then filled in all of the land to the south there. So that's that for most of the southern front line. There are a few gains, as according to Andrew Perpetua, for the Ukrainians, just a couple of fields here south of Novopokrovka. So that's interesting. It might well be a case of not happening in the last 24 hours. Could just be that the Ukrainians have controlled that for a long time, or the Russians haven't controlled it for a long time, and now there's some footage to suggest that, or it could be a counterattack by the Ukrainians. Either way, good news to see some blue on the map there as well. So we go to my ATP distilled website. We can look to see, if you come up here to the more section, we can look at the ISW daily report summary that's been condensed even further by AI. Thank you, Benny Pie, who's done this for us. Notable anecdotes, see if there's anything. Right, so we have the Russian 7th Motorized Rifle Regiment near Lukyantsy are reportedly suffering from a shortage of drinking water and are refusing some operations. Someone was saying this on my thread. Was it earlier today or maybe yesterday? Can you tell us anything else about Russians refusing to fight? I think they were mentioning the Kursk area, but this is actually in this area that we were talking about previously, where the Russians have been pushed back a little bit. So this is Lukyantsy there. Lucky I know where that is on the map. I'm a sad man, really. But so it could be some refusals from the Russians to fight in that area, and they're not being supplied with things like drinking water. And what else can we say? Just very quickly seeing if there are any more little nuggets to throw in. Russian forces have intensified their offensive near Vuhledar, made marginal gains. Russian operations near Vuhledar are likely intended to support wider Russian efforts in western Donetsk. And the Russian military command likely aims to seize Kharkov and Vuhledar to facilitate advances towards the H15 highway. Putin continues to downplay the operational impact of the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk Oblast, and the Ukrainian incursion there has had theatre-wide impacts, including forcing Russia to redeploy forces, exactly what I said earlier. So glad to see me and the ISW are on good, solid talking terms there, and we agree with each other. Indeed, it's challenged Russia's control of the theatre-wide initiative, exactly what I've been saying over the last few weeks, and done several videos on that too. Putin's rhetoric suggests his willingness to tolerate a Ukrainian presence in Kursk Oblast in exchange for gains in Donetsk, and that's absolutely, I think, obviously the case. So it appears that he's made the choice of not defending this with troops from Kursk, troops from Pokrovsk, some of his better troops having more success, and he'd rather lose some of Kursk than not gain in Pokrovsk. As it stands at the moment, the Ukrainians seem to be pushing back a little bit in Pokrovsk, while fairly much holding steady in Kursk, and that'd be interesting if Ukraine can continue that. I'd be very interested to see what the mapping does in the next 2 or 3 days. If we see a continued success for the Ukrainians in being able to halt the Russians here and even push them back in, say, New York and Pokrovsk region, then it could indicate that the Russians are at the limits of what they can deploy and successfully achieve. And with the weather onset coming soon, that could look better for the Ukrainians and the Russians, or if they can continue pushing in all of these places and we see lots more days of red pins all up and down the east, then that might not be the case. So I think the next 2-3 days, possibly week, will be incredibly important to get a sense of how the Ukrainians have reacted to the Pokrovsk and even Vuhledar successes for the Russians. In fact, let's just read this part of the ISW. So the Russian forces made no confirmed gains in the Pokrovsk direction. Of course, some of what we've seen might be subsequent to these ISW findings. Russian forces intensified their offensive operations near Vuhledar, made marginal gains there. Yeah, absolutely. And so anyway, that's this is a large problem, is that the Russian air campaign continues with missile and drone strikes targeting various oblasts across Ukraine. The guided glide bombs have been the scourge of the Ukrainians, and they continue to be so. They're absolutely unanswered at the moment, especially since the Ukrainians are completely unable to strike, and that appears to still be the case even after Ramstein. No change from the US position. They say that the Ukrainians can't use Western weapons to strike deep into Russia, and if they want to strike at these other targets, then they can use their own weapons that they're developing to do so. And the Ukrainians are saying back to that, well, we haven't quite developed them enough yet. We don't have enough, it would just be much easier if the US were able to lift those restrictions, but they seem to be unwilling to do so. Anyway, that's enough from me. Hopefully that was of use. Let me know what you think, given all the things I've been talking about. Do you agree, disagree? Let's have a friendly discussion in the threads below. Anyway, for the meantime, guys, take care. Speak soon.